So this set of notes is titled Slavery and the Slave Trade in Virginia. Up to this point, we've talked about the formation of the Jamestown colony and the start of the Virginia colony. And we've talked a lot about tobacco and how important tobacco was to the survival of Jamestown and to the success of the English colonies in the Chesapeake Bay region. We haven't talked as much yet about another important part of that tobacco economy, which is the laborers that would be working the tobacco fields. That's going to be the focus of this set of notes. So first off, we've talked a lot about tobacco needs a lot of land, right? It's a very labor-intensive crop, and so you need a lot of land to grow it because you can't plant it in the same spot over and over. But in addition to land, the early settlers in Virginia also knew they would need a lot of people to work it, to take care of the tobacco fields, to do all of the steps necessary to grow tobacco. So they unsuccessfully tried using Native Americans and indentured servants from England, and that failed for a couple of reasons. Well, first off, Native Americans refused to do the work. The men, who were oftentimes men who had been captured in battle or kidnapped and forced to work, they felt that farm work was for women, because in their culture, men did the hunting, women did the farm work. In addition, Native Americans who were forced to work the tobacco fields, a lot of them kept dying, right? Because they were exposed to these European diseases that were killing them. Plus, there was the issue that it was really easy for the Native Americans to run away, right? This was their home. They knew the back routes. They knew how to escape. They knew the woods. So for them, it was really easy to escape out of slavery and run away. So Native Americans proved to not be a reliable source of labor for the tobacco fields. They also early on tried using indentured servants from England, and we've talked about indentured servants before. Basically how it worked, you pay for their trip, you get their labor for somewhere between 5 to 12 years. It depended on the contract that you wrote up. At the end of that time period, you would then need to give them some land and some tools, and they would be free, released from the contract. Well, for one, indentured servants who misbehaved or tried to escape could be beaten. They could have their contract lengthened, right? So that became something that discouraged potential indentured servants from wanting to do it. Some of them died, right, from native attacks, or died from diseases, or they ran away. They just decided, I don't want to do this, and they ran away before their indentured period was up. There's also the issue of, even if they did make it through the whole 5 years, 7 years, you then lost their labor, right? They were freed and you needed new servants. So neither one of those really proved to be the most reliable. So settlers turned to Atlantic slavery. The first slaves appeared in Virginia at Jamestown in 1619. They were sold into slavery in Africa and then crossed the Atlantic Ocean on just awful, awful crowded slave ships through what was known as the Middle Passage. So this shows you the idea of what we're talking about. What they called the slave coast of Africa, that area in orange. There were a lot of slave traders. English and other ships would go up, load up their ships with enslaved Africans, and then sail them to the New World, primarily into South America and the Caribbean, but eventually up into the British colonies of North America. And some of these diagrams give you a sense of just how awful it was, right? This one here showing bodies, put shoulder to shoulder, back to stomach, crowded in as tight as they could possibly be crowded. Diseases sometimes took over the ships. And as you can see from this drawing, this could be showing enslaved Africans with disease who were thrown overboard to keep from spreading the disease. If there was an uprising or rebellion on the slave ship, those enslaved Africans responsible could be tossed overboard, sometimes still alive. So it's pretty awful, really pretty awful. These first enslaved Africans who came into Jamestown and into Virginia were mostly treated like indentured servants. Some of them were freed after a few years of service, and some of them were freed if they agreed to become Christian, right? If they converted to Christianity. So the first few years, it wasn't really like the system of slavery that we think of now. The system of slavery we think of now is what is called chattel slavery. It sounds like cattle, but with an H, chattel. And that basically means where a system where the enslaved person is considered property, right? And that becomes the primary system of slavery in the British colonies, starting in about the 1660s. Virginia passed the first laws that regulated how enslaved Africans would be treated. Africans were declared slaves for life. They were considered property, and they were enslaved for life. The child of a slave mother was considered a slave. So whatever children an enslaved mother had would automatically be slaves as well. And you could convert to Christianity, but that no longer meant that you were free. So they change it so that this labor source is there for life, right? They're not freed by becoming Christian, and you did not need to go and get more because some of them were freed after a few years. They were considered slaves for life. By 1700, the British became heavily involved in the slave trade. And so, right at about 1700, you start to see the number of slaves in Virginia shoot up. Give you some perspective. By 1649, there were only about 300 African slaves in Virginia. By 1680, only 7% of the population, the non-Native American population, was black. However, by 1770, that number skyrocketed to 40%, right, which is a huge jump. And really, you look at that and go, well, what happened between 1680 and 1770? What happened was the British got more heavily involved in the slave trade and started sending more and more and more slave ships to Virginia and to some of the other colonies that were growing tobacco. So why? Why was there this huge increase in slavery? Well, for one, the headright system, right? We've talked about that. It created these huge plantations, and if you're going to plant a lot of tobacco, you need a lot of labor. So they turned to slave labor to fill that need. And there were fewer indentured servants. Fewer indentured servants means you need other sources of labor. Why were there fewer indentured servants? Well, things got better in England, right? So if you were a poor person in England, all of a sudden, you may not take that chance to be an indentured servant. Things look better in England, so you'll just stay in England, right? So both of these things together created the need, the demand for more enslaved Africans in Virginia and in the other colonies that start to form as well, North Carolina, Maryland. So here's the response question. Type this down into the question part of your response box. Before Virginia changed its laws in the 1660s, a child who was born to a slave mother took the status of the father. After the law changed, the child took the status of the mother. Why do you think they made this change? All right, this is kind of a tough one. You really have to wrap your head around it. Before the law changed, a child took the status of the father. If the father was free, the child was free. After the law changed, the child took the status of the mother. Why do you think they made that change? There could be a number of reasons. Put down as many reasons as you can think of. Print off your notes before the next class.